This afternoon session with the speakers of this morning. This is a new initiative, a new way of doing things, rather than having questions and answers immediately after each speaker. We thought that it would be more productive, more interesting, more challenging to have the speakers of one half day field the questions that you will be asking them, and they can either answer each other's sort of questions or take questions from you, and you can direct questions to either of the speakers at this table or to the whole panel. So as you see, I'm not David Carr, for those of you who don't know me. I'm Christian Michel. David is held up, I think he was flying in this morning and his flight was late. So, without further ado, I pass on the mic over to you, and anyone wants to ask a question? Yes, sir.
Tony Brown. I have to admit that I work at the European Parliament now for UKIP. And the question is mostly directed at Steve Baker. I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed you this morning, but I've just done a series of voting lists on the ESFS, which is the European System of Financial Supervision. It creates a European Banking Authority, it creates an insurance supervisory body, it creates a market supervisory body, it puts in place a coordination committee for economic governance, it anticipates the creation of Euro bonds, i.e. bonds issued by the European Union for the first time. Hasn't all the power that you were talking about this morning just been transferred to the Commission and the Parliament? And having said the questions directed at you, I would actually appreciate also the opinion of your two colleagues on the same issue. In other words, great presentation, but all a bit too late.
Well, you have the mic.
Well, obviously I'd like to apologise for not coming into politics sooner. We can't win, you know. Either you have two careers beforehand, one in the Royal Air Force and one in software businesses, and come into politics late and get criticised for that. Or you go into politics early, having known a lot about politics, get told you've done nothing with your life. So I don't know how politicians can win. I came into politics because of the Lisbon Treaty, and nobody here needs me to rehearse all that nonsense. But it was a total affront to me that the Constitution was transformed into the Lisbon Treaty just to sidestep democracy. That to me revealed the nature of the whole project. I consider myself an internationalist. The Cobden Centre is the Cobden Centre for a reason. He was a liberal internationalist, considered the international man. You know, insert here long diatribe about how much I love Europe and how many friends I've got, how much work I've done, and all the rest of it. But you know, I think UKIP and the Better Off Out campaign lack ambition. Okay, I think the European Union needs to be wholly torn down. The thing is, of course, that is actually impractical unless the whole people of Europe can be persuaded to rise up and vote for politicians who are prepared in a moderate and consistent and principled and gentle way to say that the European Union project has merely succeeded in raising economic nationalism to the continental scale. That was not its purpose, it was to defeat economic nationalism. It's therefore a failure in its own terms, and that if we wish to devolve power to the lowest possible level, make it accountable, and move on into a free society, then it's clearly incompatible. So, to finish, what I want is free trade and peace amongst all the nations of Europe as well as the world. And in my view, the European Union is an obstacle to that. I would personally, as a starter for 10, suggest that the European Council, which is separate from the European Union, be used as a vehicle to promote just free trade and peace without interventionism. It's only going to happen if we win the argument for liberty.
Thank you. Any quote? No, okay. So another question, the gentleman in the back over there.
just if you'll indulge me, I actually found something in the Daily H, sorry, the Daily Mail, that is directed towards Professor Davies. A Frenchman was locked in a police cell for 2 days and is now facing court over a lewd joke email sent to the country's former Justice Minister, Rashida Dati. The man allegedly contacted the MEP at the European Parliament in Strasbourg last week and asked her if he could have an inflation. It follows that Ms. Dati's recent widely reported slip in which she mixed up the word for a sex act with inflation. The two sound familiar in French during the radio interview. At the time, she managed to laugh off her mix-up, saying she was she'd spoken too quickly. However, it appears a 44-year-old mother of one did not see the funny side of the email. Police raided the home of the 40-year-old man, somewhere in East France, after he was traced by the computer's IP address. The machine was seized and he was held for 48 hours, his lawyer said. It is illegal in France, according to this anyway, to display contempt towards a public servant. So I know that Britain does suffer from a lot of these policies, and I would say the same with Ireland, but I suppose it's more endemic and it's across the European Union, and I see freedom as receding rather than growing. And I'd just like to know your opinion on the situation, really, because it's more than just a British problem.
Yes, funnily enough, if again I can plug my new book, Jokes and Targets, which has an entire chapter called Jokes About the French and Sex. Because if you look at British or American or German jokes, and they're about France, then this is the topic. But it's also worth noting they have a very long tradition of telling sex jokes about politicians. For example, they had a president, Felix Faure, who died during a sex act with his mistress. And within 24 hours, the whole of France was telling jokes about it, including Clemenceau, his political opponent. So I'm very sad to see that a great French political tradition is now being suppressed by the French police. But given the history of France, I'm not entirely surprised.
Yes, I'll come up. I just want to say that I personally think this is the treatment of. Yes, I'm not convinced that holding him for, what was it, 48 hours was actually that bad in France. I mean, 40 years ago they'd arranged a car accident and killed him. I would argue that perhaps you should look at the context of where French state power is coming from, and that is a relatively minor problem by French standards.
Okay.
I've got a question to make about the banking solution. Are we not focusing actually on the wrong solution? When you're looking at full reserve banking, are we not actually not going far enough? Because the banks effectively have a license to trade as insolvent. The definition of insolvency is that you have assets which exceed your liabilities and you're able to meet your obligations as they fall due. And no bank is able to do that because they borrow short-term, long lend. Should we not require, but should we not simply eliminate the privilege that the banks have as opposed to all the other companies, so that they were required to be solvent? And that would be, on the same sort of required, by definition, they have full reserve banking, while also allowing banks all the freedoms that all the other companies have, and no further regulation would be required.
Well, you're absolutely right, yes. But this is not a question about whether or not we disagree or I've considered that point of view. The question is how we make a transition from where we are to where we want to be. So for me, then the question is not should we deliver what you've just suggested. Yes, we should. We should deliver banks as companies with no special privileges, just like any other. That should be our goal. There's one question to be resolved, which is whether or not demand deposits should have 100% reserves. Some libertarians argue that people should be able to enter into those. As you know, you're hinting at the issue of banks being insolvent because of demand deposits. Some people argue that you should be able to enter into such a contract even knowing that it places you at risk of losing your money. But that's the question to be resolved in terms of the destination. What I'm arguing is that, what I'm saying is we need a conversation about how we get there. So the short answer is yes, I just agree.
But it's actually not just demand deposits. Like if you have a 2-year deposit, that also should not be lent for more than 2 years by the bank, not only at money.
Sorry. Yeah. So there's a large conversation to be had here about maturity transformation, but I'm just slightly conscious I don't want to dominate the other speakers. I mean, perhaps it's part of the lesson maybe about how this works.
Very good. We'll keep your questions short, please, and so that we can take as many as possible.
Very briefly, this is in Christie Davies's neck of the woods, and with regard to the French law about ridiculing public servants. The defendant was asked from the bench, are you trying to show contempt for this court? No, my lad, was the answer. I'm trying to conceal it.
Thank you very much. This is a question for Peter Mentzel. It was an interesting sort of exposition on the historical context for von Mises. Do you think that our understanding on von Mises is detracted by the fact we don't understand his intellectual antecedents within sort of the German historical school?
Do I think that our appreciation of him is less because we don't generally perhaps because I am a historian. One of the things I was interested in doing with this project was trying to see what the historical context in which he was writing was and what some of his influences may have meant, or at least the kinds of historical processes or historical philosophies against which he was reacting were. So I guess in that sense, I guess the answer would be yes. On the other hand, I don't think that it's really necessary, perhaps, to know the minutiae of his historical antecedents to understand his broader project. But what I was, the reason I was talking about Dilthey and Droysen and Ranke and so forth was to try to get a sense of where his opposition to historicism comes from, what that's based on, and how the idea of historicism itself changed during that time. So I'm not sure I answered your question. Okay.
Thank you. And the gentleman there, and other questions in the back. So.
Thank you. My name is Martin Cox. I do a little bit of economics teaching at Oxford University. This question is for Steve. You're right that we don't think it's a good idea as economists to regulate the price of rental apartments or bread or milk or labour so much as we used to think it was a good idea. Why is it, do you think, that economists have been so loath to let go of price regulation by the government on the price of money?
It's a fantastic question to ask a politician. I think all scholars accept that credit expansion creates economic activity. The question is whether it's an illusion that must come to an end, or whether it's actually the engine for growth, genuine economic prosperity. The problem is that politicians are elected every 5 years, and over the course of time it has proven advantageous to allow economic activity to be created through currency debasement, through excessively low interest rates. Makes everyone feel good, you know, have another glass of beer, you've probably had too many. Nobody wants to go through an age of austerity. You might notice that highly responsibly, David Cameron started talking about an age of austerity, but it rapidly came to an end. Nobody wants austerity. So I think the answer to it is that we've ended up holding on to central banks because we've got fractional reserves and because it suits politicians to be able to create economic activity. It's actually a good thing that the Bank of England is at least notionally independent of government, you know, from politicians. It gives us some chance. It's actually the second stage of Huerta de Soto's plan. The third stage is 100% reserves. So in a sense, we're already going down that path. But again, the long and the short of it for me is that politicians are elected every 5 years. They have an incentive to create prosperity that at least lasts through the next election. for me, the argument we have to win is to show people that it's in their best interests if money is honest, that is, if it maintains its value. And I just leave you with a question that I put to a group of campaigners who go by the name Positive Money. We have to decide whether we think politicians and the state, or the cooperative actions of tens of millions of people, which of those two things are better able to keep money honest. Well, I believe that the cooperative actions of tens of millions of people are better able to keep money honest. But we actually have to win an argument to take money from the state and put it in the hands of the market.
Tom Burrows.
Yes, Tom Burrows. In my day job, as you know, Steve, that's what I've been supporting you guys at the Conf Centre. I'm a financial journalist, and I've had the dubious pleasure in the past of having to deal with issues such as, and this tells me how exciting my job is, things like accounting standards. And it seems to me that what you're talking about and around is about honesty, not just about honest money, but honesty in terms of the terms we use to describe the financial world. Because one thing that we need to have honesty about is things like, well, I talked about this at the lunch with Malcolm Hutty, off-balance sheet accounting. I mean, give me strength. Nothing is really off the balance sheet. There's a liability that doesn't go away. It's just held somewhere else. I think we need to really, what the Conf Centre as a subsidiary activity needs to really bash away at some of the idiotic practices which are tolerated, encouraged in business practice, like off-balance sheet liability massaging, things like fair value accounting. DeSoto talked about this. I mean, this is a joke. It means that a lot of very almost reckless financial activities are almost encouraged by the accounting profession, and it's given the imprimatur of law. So I think that honest money is to be part of a broader set of honest financial understanding. And the things like the accounting profession and some of the terms which are employed, which actually connive with many of the things that we regard as being damaging, also need to be addressed.
Okay.
I'll be really quick on this one. The short answer is I completely agree with you. I always worry about Tom's questions because I know he's more knowledgeable than I am. But yeah, completely agree with you. In the course of things, I was involved with the securities lending project at Lehman Brothers, where I was an architect on that programme. And mark-to-market was one of the things that was done there every night, and you could see the potential consequences of doing it. I've also been involved with electronic financial reporting, which has brought me into contact with a wide range of accounting standards, and I'll just stop by saying I completely appreciate the point you're making.
Good.
Yes, if I can say something wider about why inflation is so possible, it's not just the politicians, it's also people like the deception of being better off in the short term. Because a lot of the crunch comes later, it's convenient to forget about it. Now, we've talked here about monetary inflation, but it's equally true about the inflation of exam results. That people like it when A grades at A level is shoveled about, or when university degrees become dumbed down. And there comes a point where you realise that bits of paper are no longer worth anything. But when they're actually being handed out, that's what everybody wants. And having been an examiner, I can tell you the kind of intense pressure you're under to devalue that currency. And there's another currency that gets devalued, and that is criminal sentences. Whereby criminal sentences, everybody says, oh, Britain imprisons more people than other countries. That is a lie. That's a straight lie. The reason more people are in prison in Britain than in other countries is because there's more crime committed in Britain. If you divide the crime figures, you find Britain comes way down the list. And then the sentences are announced in the newspaper, and it looks, gosh, look, this chap's got 8 years. But you know damn well he'd be out before. You know, and the whole thing is fakery. So it's not just currency, it's everything else in the society is subject to the trickeries of inflation.
Yeah, Brent Calgill. Questions for Peter Mentzel. This field of timology, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but so why does a person choose apples over oranges? It seems to me that it's a pretty simple field, and don't you just ask John why he chose apples over oranges, or is there more to it than that?
Yes, that's a very good question. And if John is alive and present and we speak John's language, we can do that. But Timology, as far as I understand it anyway, was used as a tool of historical research. So this is for a case where we don't actually have access to John, and we have to try to figure out what his motivations were in choosing apples over oranges. What I was arguing was that that's where Mises appropriated this idea, or this mechanism called Verstehen, or understanding, that was the sort of tool to unlock this mechanism of Timology. But that's why, you're right, ideally, we could just ask him. He would tell us a story about, having a bad orange experience at some point in his past. But failing that, we have to try to, as a historian, try to figure out why it is he has that preference.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Just to add to that, I think from a policy perspective, it almost, I hesitate with the words, but almost doesn't matter. From a policy perspective, the key thing is that people do choose, and they choose subjectively, and they act, which I know we all embrace. But, so I'm very interested in Timology, but it feels like an academic exercise. I'm very glad people do it, but it's just my perspective as a politician. What does it mean in terms of policy? I'm not sure it means very much handing back.
Right, and that's, again, one of the things I was trying to explore in my remarks, is this relationship between the sort of economic implications of acting human beings in terms of economics or catalactics and Timology. And again, I think that for Mises and for the Austrian school, the importance of history may not lie so much, at least immediately, in policy formation, but it helps us to tell a story about why people choose the way they do. Not so much that people make choices, but why they make the kinds of choices they do. So that might be a way, maybe 2 or 3 steps removed, to arrive at certain policies, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Because there's also, in Austrian economics, a real, as far as I understand it, a kind of a, how should we say, a very forceful idea that history isn't predictive, that just because we know that John prefers apples to oranges, it doesn't really tell us much about Mary. So I see what you're saying, but I'm not sure that the point is that they're trying to describe 2 different things. Yeah. I guess is what I'm saying.
I recognise the value.
But
any other questions?
Sorry for the second bite of the cherry, but to get into banking and history, I think Steve Baker's answer is fine as far as it goes back. I don't think it goes back very far. I'm no historian of finance or economist thereof, but my understanding is, first of all, the English common law worked pretty slowly. Already by 1811, there was an important judicial decision that the money you put in a bank on deposit is not your property, but that of the bank. Now, this was long before elections were about how much employment could be increased, so we surely have to go back at least to the formation of the Bank of England and the financial structures of this country and of others for those countries to understand why the attachment to fractional reserve banking, central banking, and socialism in the area of banking is so tenacious, so deep-dived, and so presumably difficult to root out. Thank you.
Maybe there are a couple of questions there, so maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions, and it will smooth up the flow of the time.
I've just got a quick comment. I've been to a few Libertarian Alliance conferences, and I've often found that talks have been difficult to understand. I just want to congratulate the panel on making it so easy to follow.
Thank you.
That's not a question, but keep them humming like that.
David Gibson, I'm a humble member of the Contemporary Science Forum. I was interested in the comment of Steve earlier on about honest money and what the effect is.
If you have a mind, yes, it's
sorry.
Yes, that's right.
Over about the last 100 years, the money supply here has been inflated by a lot of variations on quantitative easing. The Bank of England and banks and the government have issued money to people to whom they choose. They don't give it equally to everyone. They give it to people who earn money or create wealth. They give it to the people who they choose should have money. I look upon that as extremely dishonest. Now, Steve, you mentioned that you and another Conservative MP, and I think Conservative here, were essentially against this, want to carry out action to return us to honest money. There were, say, 300 Conservative MPs and a similar number of Conservative peers. Is there any more climate within the Conservative Party? I don't have to go to the entire Conservative Party, we might be rather better than the other two major parties. Is there any more feeling within your party on months of duration and sound part of people like Cameron and Osborne to make these changes? Are they honest people? Are honest people who are trying to say, well, this honest people
I think we've got him. Yes, Stephen.
Do you want me to answer that one now?
Yeah, I'll answer that and then we'll see what...
Well, obviously I'm bound to say that senior politicians are honest people. And I sincerely believe that the leadership of the Conservative Party mean well for this country. I think there are a number of fantasies entertained about politicians, but to be honest, it's not butlins. It's quite hard work, and I think most people have got other things they could do. So everybody's in it because they want to make the country a better place. You asked specifically about whether there's appetite in the party. I'm not going to reel off a list of names of people who are interested in what I'm saying, but I could. There is such a list of names. People are interested in Austrian school economics and the Austrian theory of the business cycle, because, as I say, people are in it for the country's best interests, and they want to understand what is happening in the world. So, yes, there's appetite, but we're at the beginning of a long journey. I'm considered an outlier at the moment. We've got Douglas Carswell taking an interest, the Earl of Caithness. When the Earl of Caithness floated his act, it was a very courageous thing to do. But I now can refer to him, I can refer to Douglas, there's three of us, there's other people interested. So is there a movement building? Yes. But it does require the population, this is again back to Cobden, to defeat the Corn Laws. Cobden educated the population. And we need to do that, all of us. We need to educate the population. That will apply pressure to politicians. Politicians will pick up the grass and nettle, as it were, and off we'll go. But I think what we're doing is possible, but I think it's an extremely hard journey and possibly a long one.
Okay, Peter, you want to ask a question?
Yes. Well, by the way, I entirely agree. I think that's really the education is probably the best strategy to achieving these. But I had a question for Christie actually about jokes, and one of the things that you seem to focus in your remarks on the state and government regulation of humor and so on. But I guess what I was wondering in part is, where does sort of good manners and civility fit into this conversation? So for instance, obviously, maybe obviously to everybody in this room, we don't want to see a case where the state is policing what kind of jokes people are telling. But you could imagine a shop or a restaurant or a club where the owner decides that he doesn't want to have any dirty jokes or just any particular kinds of jokes. Or you could imagine a situation where, well, I guess I'm asking you, can you imagine a situation where there are certain kinds of jokes that may be not appropriate. I'm just sort of wondering how manners and civility, and also the idea of private property, fit into the story you're telling us.
Yes, I think as far as private property is concerned, then an employer could lay down, he could simply make it part of his terms of employment, what kind of jokes people tell at work. Where the problem arises is that employers would not do this unless they were under certain kinds of pressure. So that, for example, in America it happens because of the ridiculous situation with regard to tort law, that people will sue in the courts and get ridiculous sums of money for things that are actually trivial. They'll sue and they'll say, oh, somebody told this joke and I suffered emotional damage. Please give me £1 million. Now, I would simply say you do not permit that kind of case. You simply throw it out as being vexatious. But what happens at the moment in the United States is that employers will not only write into contracts that people shouldn't tell the jokes, but they even have a clause that say, I won't even wish to tell the jokes. And when you're at that point, I mean, you say, well, who makes the law that allows people to sue for ridiculous sums of money? And the answer is the state. And so it's not as if the employers are acting in a situation of free choice. The other thing I suspect is there are pressure groups, and the pressure groups may well work through a labour union. And again, it's not free. Now, when you look at situations where people are free, they very rapidly work out codes of behaviour of their own. And I know of an empirical study, for example, in the Netherlands, where a colleague of mine simply listened in and observed as an anthropologist, people telling jokes in various working class environments. And what she noticed was there were no restrictions at all on the kind of joke that people told, whereas there were restrictions on telling jokes that upset other particular individuals. And this is what people get wrong, is they fail to see that there's a total distinction between upsetting an individual who is present and obeying some sort of abstract rule with regard to people who are not present. And those are totally different. That civility is about people who are present. So that, for example, if someone's in the presence of his mother-in-law, he might well say, well, I'm not going to tell any mother-in-law jokes as a matter of civility. But for someone to turn around and to say there's a general rule, you shouldn't tell jokes about mother-in-laws, or about Scotsmen, or about blondes. It's just ludicrous. You can't have general rules of that kind. You can only have particular rules that relate to particular small groups.
Right. There were a couple of questions over there, and one was there, and one in the back there, and a third one, and then we'll stop.
Bearing in mind that the Austrian school is Austrian, and Dr. Mentzel's paper to us featured so many Germans, why is libertarianism not the power that it could be and ought to be in Germany?
Okay, there is a question over there, Helen, and then to your left.
Hi there, Richard Carey. Questions to the panel. The first one is, what is the risk that in responding to political correctness that we end up by trying to hoist them on their own petard and get just as petty as our adversaries? Secondly, I wondered if there was any significant difference between Karl Popper's view of historicism and Ludwig von Mises. And thirdly, how best to seize the evident anger towards bankers and turn that into anger against the system, really, and stop people straying out to fly, which I would think is the bonuses, and swallowing the candle, which is the monetary system itself.
Thanks for the 3 short questions, but there will be long answers, I'm afraid. So, yes.
I appreciate a second opportunity to ask a question. John Lawler, this is directed at Professor Davies again. I noticed his tie to South Park, and there was an unfortunate event where one of the recent episodes depicting Muhammad in some unenlightened way was actually withdrawn eventually by Comedy Central. I'd just like to know, my background is clinical psychology. What do you and Hannah think of what we in the West think of our sort of our sense of self, our self-confidence, when we rush to appease individuals in this situation? I feel that the victim status that is, you know, there was genuine victimhood in the past endured by minorities and still exists today. The victim status is actually a strength now. And the organisation of the Islamic Conference, 57 countries blocked in the UN, are pushing and acquiesced by Obama, of course, to have blasphemy genuinely outlawed at the UN. And obviously that would be an international law, quote unquote. What is it in the Western psyche that is so suicidal? And without all this pandering, how do we actually get people to, outside this room obviously, to actually believe in ourselves, but not just that, but actually put ourselves forward and rubbish these nonsense laws? How do we actually
Okay. So you want to start and then we'll go from right to left. Okay.
Well, there are two things I think one can say on this. First of all, somebody asked about German libertarianism. I can assure you there are very large numbers of jokes about Germans and obedience. And I can assure you that a German joke is no laughing matter. But in fairness, I have a very large collection of jokes made by Germans and in German that are very good indeed. It's a complete myth that the Germans are humorless. But nonetheless, buffet is buffet. And I think it's part of a certain history that if you say, you look at the Austrians and you say, where did they get this freedom philosophy from? It was derived in opposition to other more powerful groups within their own society. That's why it evolved. It was an oppositional doctrine.
Yes, Germany and libertarianism. I think that actually picking up on what you were saying, it's interesting that the term, the Austrian school, was invented by, I think it was Schmuller, as a term of abuse against von Mises, because what he was trying to do was accentuate the fact that von Mises and his circle were this sort of tiny provincial kind of group, so he called them Austrians as opposed to sort of accentuate that marginal quality, I guess you could say. But I think that one way of answering your question could be to think about the impact of the German historical school of Schmuller and Zombart, because those were the guys that actually kind of won, at least in the short term, of the Methodenstreit. And I think it was tied up with the whole project of building the German state, that came to actually take precedence over everything. And in a way, one of the things I was arguing ends up also transforming the whole project of historicism. And here we get to the question about Popper. I think that Mises' own understanding of what historicism was very heavily colored by Popper's view of historicism, which was in turn based almost completely on this latter, this later historical stage of the historicist project, not the earlier one that was developed by Ranke and Meinecke. But I think that's an important point. Steve Davies actually wrote a book on historicism that outlines, I think, these points in some greater detail. But I think that's the Popperian Misensian actually.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, to finish, I'm actually going to take issue with Christie on a point, but just to deal with some of the other questions. If you want a really good account of the death of classical liberalism in Germany, then I recommend Mises' Omnipotent Government, The Rise of the Total State and Total War. You may know that Mises was of Jewish descent, lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in what is now Poland, and he lived through the various nightmares of the death of liberalism and the rise of Nazism. And he gives a particularly good account in Omnipotent Government. It's worth reading that book in concert with Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies and The Road to Serfdom. And we tend to hear about the road to serfdom, but actually that particular triplet is a very important triplet to read. You mentioned that Popper versus, I've lost where you were, but Popper versus Mises on historicism.
Be careful, Christian, it's very hot.
It's a very interesting question because of the way Popper treats science versus the way that Mises treats science, and the extent to which they agreed with one another or not. And to me, actually, in many ways, they do agree, because Mises was, in a sense, too much of an extremist in saying everything had to be a priori. Well, I actually quite like the work of Roger Koppel, or Kerpel, depending on how good you are with your name. He tends to synthesise an Austrian approach with a statistical analysis which tends to seek to disprove what he's concluded from an Austrian a priori set of reasoning. And I feel there's a new economics emerging which develops some of those ideas. The other one about, all of this is about the history of ideas, by the way. The theme in the three questions and in the answers we've been given, for me, is about how ideas grow and spread and die and are supplanted, and generally how human lives are influenced by them. We've mentioned Islam. Now, it's a particularly sensitive issue for me. We think perhaps as many as 19% of my electors are Muslims. The bomb plot to which you referred was plotted largely in Wickham. Now, I get along very, very well with my Muslim constituents. And I think one of the strange errors, if I may, that we make is we say they. And we do draw a big circle around when we say they. And it is collectivism. And there are as many types of Muslim as there are individuals, as there are as many types of libertarian as there are libertarians or conservatives or whatever. And I'm very nervous of drawing a circle around any group and saying they, and they are a problem, this, that, and the other. The vast majority of Muslims are people who believe in peace, because that is what the religion is fundamentally about. Hard as it may be to believe, it is a religion of peace and of family and of equality and of freedom from arbitrary government and of property. Because when I stand in the mosque, as I've done, at a meeting where a fatwa was read against terrorism, and I stood at that meeting and I explained those values, family as the basic building block of society, and they are, by the way, straight out of Mises' classical liberalism, the classical tradition. Everyone agreed with me. So, in terms of values, the vast majority of Muslims are very, very close to where we are. Hard as that may be to believe, because you can advocate the same values and get a response that is positive. Now, that then brings us on to the subject of extremism, and I'm afraid there are some extremist Christians, there are some extremist atheists, and there are unfortunately some extremist Muslims. Now, right now, we seem to be going through a process of the main threat to our physical security, at least as currently portrayed, is from extremists of a Muslim persuasion. But this is not, we should not, particularly as believers in freedom and individual liberty, we must not allow ourselves to paint everyone with a particular belief framework with the same label that they are a threat to us. It isn't true, and really one of the key jobs I must do, in a sense more important than the questions about health or money and banking or jobs, one of the things I must do is stand between my peaceful, peace-loving constituents and those people who would demonise them. It's probably the most important job I have to do.
Thank you very much, and join me in thanking the panel and thanking you because you've asked excellent questions. So.